first video that I introduced with pictures was from my book called Solar Plexus. And that was just an introduction to what the subject of that book was. Then after that I showed the Christian legacy, and then I showed the Protestant Revolution, and now I'm talking about the self-defense from the monarchy and theocracy, the popes, where the religion has the absolute authority and we simply are not allowed to speak, and under the kings, any original thought I might have that doesn't happen to match what the king thinks is treason. So human beings were severely oppressed under those former two systems. So in the 1400s, it would have happened 100 years earlier, Florence became a republic, and why it didn't happen 100 years earlier was the King of England borrowed a vast sum of money from the Florentine bankers and could not repay it. That is why in the 1930s, the late 1930s, Mussolini made an attempt to get England to repay that vast debt that left the Italians bankrupt in the 1300s. But that didn't work. Anyway, so the alternative to the republic, the alternative to theocracy and monarchy is the republic. The republic implies that the people in charge are one of many. So to declare a republic means you have to acknowledge fellow human beings. In the beginning, it was only the leading families. The Medicis, the Pazzi family, and these were an aristocratic class. So my heading here is the Republic of Merchants and Bankers is the alternative to theocracy and monarchy. Therefore, to declare a republic, you have to have democracy, which became a political necessity belonging only to the foremost families, not the poor people or the ordinary people, not quite yet. Of democracy, humanism has to emerge. And for that to happen, all the classical writers, the playwrights, the architects, the sculptors, after all, democracy was first defined in Greece, of all the countries, and then the Romans took over the Greek legacy and made the civic order for a very large state. And all the words of the Roman form of government, the senators and all of that, is what is still in use today. If you look at the modern American state, the president was called the emperor, the senators are the people with the most important say, and then the House of Representatives, where the ordinary people were allowed to speak their points, and then the senators made up their minds what to do about the points. So in the ballot box, all of this comes out of the classical world. So at this time, all the books which represented the writings of Socrates and Plato, and Plato wrote the sayings of Socrates, Aristotle, Epicurus, the musician, Pythagoras, Thucydides, the first historian to write the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, all these writers of tragedy and poetry and murals and sculpture and architecture was all being revived. And they discovered that under the ground in Rome, for example, they discovered this whole legacy of Rome. So artists from Florence would go on a mission to go digging in the ground and look for classical sculptures. Brunelleschi went with Donatello, and they went and looked around and they discovered the proportions of architecture from the classical world. And this is what the Renaissance personifies, the rediscovery of the human legacy, of human being. It's still a dirty word to the modern churches, particularly the Protestants, who saw that too much emphasis on my own story, which they would classify as egotism or passion or dancing and parties and free will, was against religion, so it was very much suppressed by the church. But oddly enough, it was from Rome, when the Pope put the crown on the head of Charlemagne, the emperor, the first thing he did was set up schools, and he set up monks to copy all the classical references that were existent at the time. And so really, basically, through the church, the humanism of the classical world was presented to ordinary people, or people of the secular world. And that is why, when Julius II was the Pope, he wanted a new St. Peter, and built completely in the Roman style, but on a larger scale than anything that had ever been built in Rome. And that's what was going on at the time, to reassert that the church was the one and only authority. So I said the princes now became the patrons of the arts and the sciences. They used their profits to have new buildings designed in the cities where they lived. Orphanages and libraries and chapels were built, all in the classical style. And secular subjects appeared, which is called history painting. They wanted to commemorate battles. Before that, only scripture was commemorated in the church art, in religious art, and for the kings, only what the kings did was commemorated on parchments. And then the bankers grew more and more powerful, and I'll read a letter from a banker to a king when we get to the pictures. They acquired power and influence because of all the people who borrowed the money from them at an interest rate, and therefore they were able to influence world affairs. And that's the capitalism that came forward into our world. Both kings and popes were in debt to the bankers. And these original bankers were not Jewish, as everybody's quite anti-Semitic these days, and they say it's all the Jews who are the bankers, but this is not so in the Renaissance. I know I've shown this page before, but to show the absolute power of the Pope to make a decree and award everything west of this line to Spain, and everything east of that line to Portugal, when he didn't own any of it. But since he was the representative of God, he felt the right to just simply take over the entire world as God's territory, and all the conquerors and explorers and everyone who went out into this undiscovered world were at liberty to simply take whatever they found there. At this point here, I want to show that Cortez, who conquered Mexico over here, in this section, Cortez brought home to Belgium, to Brussels over here, some of the artifacts and things they had robbed from the Aztecs. And Dürer, the artist who I'll show you immediately after this, sorry I bumped the table, the artist that I'll show you immediately after this picture, went to see that exhibition in Brussels. He was on a tour, and he's just described one of the grand processions, and wherever he went he was feted and given banquets in his honor. And he took the time to go and see this exhibition of artifacts and objects which were brought back from Mexico at the time. I'm pointing this out as a feature of humanism. He writes, "I have seen the things which have been brought to the king from the new land of gold, Mexico. A sun, all of gold, a whole fathom broad, and a moon, all of silver of the same size. Also 2 rooms full of the armor of the people there, and all manner of wondrous weapons of theirs, harness and darts, very strange clothing," they made clothes out of feathers, very strange clothing, bed covers, and all kinds of wonderful objects of human use. Much better worth seeing than prodigies. Prodigies meant people born with 2 heads or with 3 legs or whatever, and people were fascinated to go and see those things. And Dürer felt it was more wonderful to go and look at the production of men from foreign lands that were beyond imagination. He says, "These things are so precious, they are valued at 100,000 florins. All the days of my life I have never seen anything that rejoiced my heart so much as these things. For I saw amongst the wonderful works of art, and I marveled at the ingenia of men in foreign land. Indeed, I cannot express all here of what I thought there." So Dürer was not against, he did not think of them as pagans. Even in the Renaissance period, which happened in the 1400s and by the 1500s, it's called the High Renaissance, because then artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael were the top artists of the day, and they had taken a distance from what they thought of as a crude stillness of the early Renaissance. They were the pioneers, the people who opened up the whole subject of perspective, and they tried to fuse sacred geometry with human psychology, and they used the body and the passions in the body to express the attitudes of the people being portrayed. And as I said before, human beings were now admitted to the sacred picture plane, whereas before this, under popes and kings, this never happened. It was always only about the king, or only about the pope and the scriptures, and human beings simply were not significant or relevant to be shown. They have always been subordinate and obedient or killed, quite frankly. So we're looking at a picture. It's an engraving, a wood engraving by Albrecht Dürer, who was an artist north of the Alps. He wasn't Italian, so the imagery is a little bit more stressed and strange than the calm relaxation of the Italians. And here you do see people who are virtually naked, but the explanation is this is a bathhouse, and this is the end of a work day, and these men are all relaxing in a bathhouse. This guy's drinking beer, this guy's playing music with this guy on the flute, this guy's holding a flower, so he must be in love, or more meditative and philosophical. He's got a sort of a little hammer thing here, and this man is just contemplating the whole scene. But these are Greek statues, naked Greek statues. Even at this time, it wasn't possible to show human life naked. If you did see nudity in the Renaissance period, it was always the gods of the Greeks or the gods of the Romans or some myth or mythology, and they were allowed to be naked, but never us. So this is rather daring to show us in a semi-naked state, and it's not even a religious subject. It's not about the king, it's not about scripture, it's about men relaxing at the end of the day. And look at all the details. This is a kind of fountain you would find in Germany in little villages, and the people use this water for their village. Here's a castle up on the hill. Look at the steep roof of that house. Here's a tree, and then there's a river, and another piece of castle, the walls of the city, and then you see these little houses and these steep roofs. Why they had these steep roofs is because of the snow. They didn't have snow in Italy, so roofs were inclined to be flatter. But north of the Alps they had to be steep so the snow would slide off. We had a studio, and last year the whole ceiling collapsed in on the building because it snowed, and then it rained, and then it snowed, and then it rained, and the next thing, this huge massive weight just collapsed the ceiling into our studio. So this is Albrecht Dürer. Here's his famous signature, and he puts plants in, and here's a chalice with water. This looks like a heart. I have no idea what that is, but that's not a stone. And then the grains of wood. Now the point of this is the printing press was just invented. So Dürer specialized in wood engravings, so these could be made into prints, and prints began to be sold. So making one cut like this could produce 50, 60 copies of the same picture. And that's one of the big assets of the printing press. And artists had to learn how to become graphic artists, as we call them. In other words, one image can be duplicated 1,000 times. And the last thing I want to say is, check this man out leaning on his elbow. Look at the attempt to learn the muscles of the actual human body. This was not done before the Renaissance. The last time the actual anatomy of human beings was studied was in the time of Greece and Rome. And this was demolished by the Christians because they called it paganism, and it was inadmissible. And at this time, philosophers were discovering the works of Cicero and Socrates and Plato, and they were very wise, speaking about the secular world, the way governments worked, human behavior, and it was a complete and total revelation about human life, which had been suppressed for 1,400 years, principally by the Church. So here we see my rendering of the Duke of Urbino, and he would only have his face expressed from one side, because the other side of his face was scarred in battle. That's why he had this freaky nose. It was chopped off by a sword. But here's the Duke of Urbino, and he was a patron of the arts. Unfortunately, however much of a courtier and a gentleman he was, he, in conjunction with the Vatican, were involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano. They only killed the one brother. They did not kill Lorenzo, and it didn't succeed. So here we are expressing, this is a rendering of a Masaccio, one of the early Renaissance artists, who used the classical Greek sculpture. Here's a Venus, but he tilted the head back, and she's covering her breasts and her vagina as a form, as an expression of shame, and Adam's covering his face. So they were nude, but this is the moment when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, using classical statues to show a naked human form, which means that still, for the mass of humanity, even though we weren't under the king or under the pope, we were still under the duke, and we were subject to his decrees. But he was a patron of the arts, and I wrote at the top here, The Courtier by Castiglione, he was the patron of Castiglione, who wrote this book on how a man should behave. And that's when the term gentleman was defined for the first time. So he was a Renaissance prince. Here we see Cosimo de' Medici, the first of the famous Medici family. He was a banker, and he said banking is the means to independence, and thus they funded Florence and maintained its independence from the power of the church. That is why the Pope joined in with the Duke of Urbino to get rid of these Medicis, because they were too powerful, and they were allowing all sorts of secular subjects to be portrayed as the art that they ordered from the artists. Here we see the monk Savonarola, and this is a symptom. See how in these days prelates and preachers are chained to earth by love of earthly things. The cure of souls is no longer their concern. They are content with the receipt of revenue, all the money issues. The preachers preach for the pleasures of princes, to be praised and magnified by them. And they have done even worse than this, inasmuch as they have not only destroyed the church of God, but built up another after their own fashion. This is the new church, no longer built of living rock, namely of Christians, steadfast in the living faith, and in the mold of charity. Here's the answer of what he's bitching about. Go thou to Rome and throughout Christendom, in the mansions of the great prelates and great lords, there is no concern save for poetry and the oratorical art. Go thither and see thou shalt find them all with books of the humanities in their hands, and telling one another that they can guide men's souls by means of Virgil, Horace, and Cicero. The only hope that now remains to us is that the sword of God may soon smite the earth. So the church was very much against this humanist revolution that was taking place. The saying at the top of the page, neither a borrower nor a lender be, is what is spoken by the father of Ophelia. And she says that to the son before the son goes off on a venture. Neither a borrower nor a lender be. This doesn't mean from friends borrow and lend. It means borrow money from the bank or lend money to a borrower because of the interest rate. It was considered a crime. This is a philosopher called Poggio in 1540 who wrote an essay called Concerning Avarice. And he put as the statement of his thesis, money, which is now replacing the authority of the Pope and the King, money is an indispensable goad for the state, and those who seek money must be considered its basis and foundation. Now this is capitalism in its earliest stages. I'm putting this page away because I'm going to read this letter, a letter from a German banker to a Habsburg emperor. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, the big king, Charles V, and he had borrowed money. This letter was written in 1511. Your Imperial Majesty is doubtless well aware how I and my nephews have been devoted to the service of the House of Austria and have promoted its progress in all humility. On that account, we had dealings with the late Emperor Maximilian, your Imperial Majesty's grandfather, and promised our help in acquiring the Roman crown for your Imperial Majesty against some of the electors, which should establish your faith and trust in me, and perhaps in no one else. Also for the consummation of the aforementioned project which we undertook, we supplied a fine sum of money which I raised not only from my own resources and from my nephews, but also with great loss from among my other good friends, in order that so praiseworthy a purpose of your Imperial Majesty for high honour and the public good might win success. It is also well known and clear as day that your Imperial Majesty could not have acquired the Roman crown without my help, as I can demonstrate by documents of all your Imperial Majesty's commissioners. Nor have I sought my own profit in this undertaking, for if I had remained aloof from the House of Austria and had served France, I would have attained much profit and money which was then offered to me. Your Majesty may well ponder with deep understanding the damage that would have resulted for your Imperial Majesty in the House of Austria. Considering all this, I humbly petition your Imperial Majesty graciously to consider my faithful and humble services which have advanced your Majesty's welfare, and to decree that the sum of money due to me together with the interest should be discharged and paid to me without further delay. I shall always be ready to serve your Majesty in all humility, and I humbly remain at all times your Imperial Majesty's to command. Your Imperial Majesty's most humble servant, Jacob Fugger. He was a German banker, and he had banks in every city across Europe, from London to Germany. And he was speaking as though he was humble, but he was demanding the money back from His Majesty, who needed that money to win his election, same as the people using corporations today. Now here's a letter of Maximilian written in 1500, a Habsburg emperor on himself. I am a king of kings, for no one regards himself bound to obey me, while the king of Spain is a king of men, since men, though they raise objections, render him obedience, and the king of France is a king over animals, for no one ventures to dispute his authority. So that gives you a clue of what the relationship between the kings and the bankers were. This is a very, very good example of what is meant by a Renaissance painting. It is the resurrection of so-called classical values, but clothed in modern life. For example, perspective, which is the rendering of space. You see how these figures are huge and those figures are small? The difference in scale gives you the idea that there's a recessive space into the wall, as though we're looking into a mirror. Looking at the fresco generally, it's very clear that there are three dominant colors: the red, the black and the white. So if you look at the subject, this is Christ being beaten on the eve of judgment, which is the judgment day for Jesus. There's Pontius Pilate sitting on the throne. There's two people beating him. And this one's got his back to us, and this one's facing us. So it's almost like a circle. Now, to return to perspective, if you can see that line of perspective, it points straight to the face of Jesus. Well, this is how they incorporated sacred geometry with human life. This fusion of the space around us with the psychological drama is what the Renaissance artists were discovering and doing to the best of their ability. So what we see here is, in this square, this area behind Jesus, it's black. So that black relates to this black in the ceiling here. So that black is meant to be helping the eye to get to the focal point of the picture. There you see Jesus tied with his hands behind him, and this guy's got a whip and that guy's got a whip. And if you look, he's tied to a column. And what do you see on top of the column? You see a statue of a golden man. This is a symbol for the resurrection. And one of the uncanny things that it takes years to notice these things, he's standing on here, a black circle. And the column is the dot in the middle of the black circle. And if you look above, that piece of the ceiling is brilliantly lit compared with the other areas of the building. So it symbolizes that through death, the resurrection occurs. And the Renaissance artists, these are artists before Raphael and Leonardo and Michelangelo, these artists were focused on keeping everything still and calm. Nobody knows for sure who these three characters are. They're having such a calm discussion while this drama is going on in the background. Normally the scene like this is put on a stage with a lot of distorted-faced people saying, kill him, get the bastard, or whatever. Here we see it's almost like happening in a back room, and it only concerns the few people present at this moment of truth in the Christian religion. So that's Della Francesca. Here we see a chart. I try to simplify a very complicated matter down into three rough periods of art. The first stage of art was the icon, which was portable. It was a sacred picture plane. Images were derived from sacred scripture, where the authority was God. Everything that we would see is a concept. It's nothing to do with experience. And they had absolute truths of the soul, which is unchanging. The style was a geometrical stylization, plus the verifying sacred logic or words of God. This was considered truth. The revolution of the Renaissance was to introduce a new kind of picture plane, a wall service of the interior of a public building, moral picture plane, images of collective experience with designated value drawn from life, authority, God, the kingdom, the state. This is called history painting. Events which authorize authority and sanction order and enforce civic rights. Image reflect body and mind united in an ideal style, hence it was moral. It sets an example for collective life. The style is classical, geometrical and organic fusion, focal point sacred or eternal, encompassed by the temporal state or nature. And it means the middle figure, the focal figure of the picture plane was always a king or Jesus or some permanent person, some famous person. And human life could be expressed on the perimeter of this sacred focal point. The blending of the sacred with the profane, the immortal with the mortal, truth with the flesh. And this was the tradition of illusionism. You think you're looking into space, but it's not. It's a flat wall. And then tabula rasa is the modern age, where you don't have to see a concept, you don't have to see a moral. It can be bacteria, it could be a sliced up shark, it could be a poop made into a bronze and kept in a little plastic box. This is the modern age, Andy Warhol and all the rest. Images derived from mechanical means. It's an existential picture plane. Images of social compacts, that is industry, ideology, politics, the individual and the anti-individual, authority, state, bank, material, location, signature. It's about existence. Images derived through perception or imagination, psychology, the individual through the authority of the governing state, race or prevailing custom established by the sword, or the rights of existence coded by law, the physical properties of matter, neon lights, stainless steel, plastic, concrete, any material that is discovered. The style is cinematic, mathematical, decorative, mechanical, physiological, industrial, electronic, biological, psychic, or emotional. That is abstract, primitive. It's about being and non-being, confrontation or indifference. And the figures, the realm of this art is facts. It's not about morals or anything to do with illusionism and truth. These were the two prevalent styles of the Renaissance. The realism of the austere form, which was strictly bound in geometry and rather solid and still. This style, the more feminine style, is the aesthetic or decorative form. This style is designed to liberate the emotions through beautiful colors and through graceful movements and figures lightly dancing. Ballet comes out of this tradition, and this is more grounded, more austere. It's the masculine principle. I won't read all this. Now I can show you the Mantegna picture, which will come here. Mantegna.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a range of who these artists were. Giotto was the guy who started it all. He tried to work out the roundness of figures to make the picture plane not stylized geometrical, but to give it a density and a volume. Ghiberti was a sculptor. He designed the Gates of Paradise of the Baptistry in Florence. Alberti, who you'll see after this picture is shown, how he used the classical tradition in a sacred subject. He was very much into architecture, Alberti. He could do anything really. Masaccio brought the sweetness and light into his picture, the gradation of tones as they fall over a body. Botticelli was like this floating figures in diaphanous robes. He did sacred and pagan themes in his art. Raphael was the sublime artist of the time, sweetness and light they called him. Mantegna, he's the artist which we saw. Donatello, he invented the first freestanding sculptures in bronze since the time of ancient Greece and Rome. Della Francesca, you've seen the example of this very room that I've tried to draw from a different perspective. Brunelleschi invented the Dome of Florence, which is a double dome. There's an inner dome and the outer dome. Ficino was a philosopher of the persuasion of Plato. And then, of course, Michelangelo, whose giant sculptures invented a new age. This is a triptych, which means it's 3 paintings relating to one subject. In the central panel, we see the ideal of the Madonna and the Child. It's of interest to note that the Bible is constructed on the basis of 3 women. The first one is Eve and what she did. The second one is Sarah, who gave birth to a child from a barren womb. And the third one is the Madonna, Mary, who gave birth to Jesus from a virgin womb. And the interesting thing is, if Mary had not said yes, there would be no Christianity. There would be no Jesus. So the cult of Mary is very strong. Although there are many scholars who credit it from even former religions, and it's probably true. But for our purposes, I just wanted to explain why Mary is so important. Isn't it interesting that underneath her throne, you see this piece of round architecture here? That is a rose window, which you would always see in the cathedrals of the north anyway. Anyway, there's Mary with Jesus, and look at this beautiful curve of the child. If you look at all the ornaments on the architecture around, this is pure classical sculpture, classical statuary, the way the temples were arranged in ancient Greece. And this is what's meant by the rediscovery of the classical world happened in the time of the Renaissance. The proportions. Here again we see the importance of perspective. It comes to there, to the feet of Mary, and this side to the feet of Mary. So these 3 separate panels are all united to the center through the perspective. At the front here we see these garlands of fruits and laurel leaves, which means truth and fertility and plenty. This beautiful red. The painting itself is much more beautiful than this book is showing you, I assure you. Through the back, between these columns, you see the landscape. This is called the Saint Zeno altarpiece. The Saint Zeno, there he is, Saint Zeno, was the archbishop of this cathedral in Mantua, in Verona, the city of Romeo and Juliet. That's where you would see this. So there's Madonna in the center, and these are little angels around her. In the Renaissance, children symbolized our soul. Why? Because our first state as babies is our most innocent state. So our eternal soul is expressed as children. Down here, look, there's the angel with the lute pointing this way, and on the other side, another little angel and the lute's pointing in. The Renaissance artists were always aware of this symmetry, and you see the composition is definitely based in a triangle, which simplifies everything. No matter how many details we see, the triangle helps you localize the focal area. And then look how the figures start off large, smaller, 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 large, smaller, 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 so we get that depth, that space that human beings live in. Another interesting thing about the Renaissance is, because the subjects allowed for human beings to be expressed in the picture plane, whereas before the Renaissance this never happened, each saint has got their own character. Each one has got their own body pose, which reveals their innate attitude. So here we see John the Baptist. Here we see Pope Gregory. Here are the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John the evangelist. Here's Peter holding the key in the book, and there's Paul. So I can't read them all because I'm not a Catholic and I'm not absolutely acquainted with all the church fathers, but that's of no matter. We're looking at what the Renaissance brought to human consciousness in our evolution towards the modern world. New Age. So these are the Renaissance artists, the early Renaissance. This is just to show you a galaxy of the writers of the time. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy. Decameron by Boccaccio was man and woman meeting each other in a garden of nature, and conversations between men and women occurred under his authorship. And these sonnets invented by Petrarch were all about this woman that had died. And so all his poetry was dedicated to her memory. Here we have Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales. This is a great work of literature from the Catholic era of English history. And here we have William Shakespeare from the time of Elizabeth I, who followed her father Henry VIII, who separated England from the Church of Rome and invented the Church of England. So this was the classical era of English literature. Boethius was the first philosopher after the Greeks. He was very ancient. Beowulf, the Wanderer, are barbarian, so-called barbarian writings. Ossian and the Eddas are French. Eddas is German. And then these are the popes, the writers of the Bible in Latin, the translations of the Vulgate. So this just gives you a view, a grand view of the literature of the times. Here we see the princes and their dressing. When it started off in the early 1400s, their dresses went, or their robes, I better call them, not dresses, went down to the knee. And as time passed, the hem went up and up and up and up and up, so that the whole leg and the buttocks and the codpiece would show. And it was rather sexy, which of course sparked off the moralistic outrage against all this. And women given to vanity, as it was called, beautiful dresses and ribbons and fashion, were all warned about the coming of old age, that every woman would lose her beauty sooner or later. Here is an image of St. Francis. When he was a young man, he walked straight out of his father's house, who was a very prosperous merchant. He just took off all his clothes and walked out of the city naked. And he would only wear sort of rough, uncomfortable cloth after that. And he lived and was dedicated to poverty. And why he's a humanist is because he wrote all his songs, all his poems, all his prayers, humanized the universe around him. Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Death, and so on. And the climax of the man of science, who was the aspiration of the age, was to become a universal man. This is my rendering of Leonardo, where his brain is like a storm in the sky with a lightning bolt going down his spine, which went out through his hand, and he studied absolutely everything. I put a scalpel on the drawing board because he was one of the people to truly explore human anatomy. He cut through the skin and he studied the bones and where the veins were, and he made diagrams of everything that he saw, which is quite a revolution, because it was considered profane to dare to cut open a body and look at the mystery beneath the skin. But he was a painter, a musician, an inventor. Everything that was believed to be possible, Leonardo personified. So this is just to give you an idea of how the Renaissance period are the first seeds, the first glimpse of what became the 20th century. It still had to evolve through many stages, but this is where it all started, at the time of the Renaissance. Well, this was a long recording, so thank you if you got this far. Bye-bye.